My brother said it's just money, which you, as always, give to your wonderful brother, so I blocked the accounts. Hey folks, before I dive into this, I just want to say, if you're enjoying these kinds of personal stories, it would mean the world if you could subscribe, like the video, and turn on notifications. Seriously, not many people stick around to the end, and the channel could really use the boost. Thanks for your support. Hello, Reddit. I'm Michael, 34, from a small town in Georgia, and I work as an HVAC specialist. It's not glamorous, but it pays the bills and keeps me sane. I'm not really one for drama, but my life has quietly revolved around someone else's needs for as long as I can remember. That someone is my younger brother, Trevor. Trevor is 31 now, and growing up, he was always the brilliant one, the dreamer, the kid with potential. While I was learning how to stock shelves at the grocery store after school, he was in his room on the family computer, creating. No one could ever explain what exactly he was creating. He was just always in some phase of working on a screenplay, designing a game, learning to code, or building an app that never saw the light of day. I didn't mind at first. I figured we were different, and that was okay. But over time, I started noticing a pattern. Every time there was a sacrifice to be made, it was me who had to make it. When I was 17, I had saved up $1,200 working part-time at PriceSmart. I was so proud of myself. It took months of early shifts, unloading produce trucks at 6 in the morning, and working double weekends just to put that money together. I had my eye on this '96 Honda Civic, a little rough around the edges, but reliable. It was listed for $1,450, and the guy was willing to let it go for $1,200 cash. I had the money in a lockbox in my closet and everything. The day I told my mom about the car, she started crying. Not just tearing up, like full-blown sobbing at the kitchen table. I asked what was wrong, and she said Trevor had a breakdown again. I guess he'd been refusing to leave the house for days, and she'd found him curled up in the laundry room, hyperventilating. She said it was his social anxiety, and the therapist recommended an intensive camp, like a retreat for teens dealing with mental health stuff. But it wasn't covered by insurance. It would cost exactly $1,200. It was one of those moments where everything slows down. I remember staring at the cracked vinyl of the kitchen chair I was sitting in and thinking, this can't be real. But then she looked up at me with puffy eyes and said, "You always do the right thing, Michael. He needs this." She didn't ask. She didn't have to. I gave her the money the next morning. She said it would be temporary, that I'd get it back when they figured things out. I never did. Meanwhile, Trevor didn't come back from that camp cured or confident or transformed. He came back the same as he left, just with a few new phrases like my triggers and emotional dysregulation. They sounded serious, and suddenly everything was about managing Trevor's environment. I had to be quieter. Keep the TV volume low. Avoid inviting friends over. Be understanding. I started working full-time right after high school. College wasn't in the cards for me, and honestly, I didn't mind. I got my HVAC certification and eventually landed steady work. I moved out at 22 into a little duplex. Trevor was still at home, still trying to launch something. My parents supported him well into his 20s. Every time I'd visit, it was like stepping into a museum exhibit of Trevor's potential. Screens, sketches, stacks of notebooks. No job, no rent. Just working on his next big thing. There was a stretch of years where I basically became the backup emergency fund for the household. My dad's hours got cut, and mom called me crying again. Electric bill overdue, car insurance late. Trevor couldn't pitch in, of course, so I'd cover it. Not because I wanted to, because they asked, and because saying no felt like betraying them somehow. I even co-signed for a used car when Trevor was 24 because they said he needed it to get to therapy and job interviews. That was a forward focus that I ended up paying off myself when he missed 2 months of payments and the lender started calling me. He blamed it on forgetting, then on his anxiety. Mom said, "He's trying, sweetheart. He just needs a little more time." I should have said no more often. I know that now. The real kicker came last year when my dad had back surgery and couldn't work for a couple months. Trevor was unemployed again. In between projects, Mom said, I was the only one earning. I paid for their groceries, utilities, even their internet, because Trevor needed it for his freelance work. He was tutoring online. I never saw a single paycheck from it. You'd think all of this would earn me some acknowledgement. Gratitude. Something. But nah. Every family gathering, every phone call, every goddamn holiday, it was always about Trevor. How Trevor had a new idea. How Trevor was working on something exciting. I'd tell them I got a raise, and Mom would say, "That's great, honey. Trevor's designing a video game. Did I tell you? He's really passionate about it." I kept working. 60, sometimes 70 hours a week. Summers were brutal, especially in Georgia, where stepping into an attic in July felt like crawling inside a toaster oven. But I did it. HVAC work isn't glamorous, but it's solid, honest, and pays well if you hustle. So I hustled, got certified, took every extra job I could. Commercial work, residential, weekend calls, middle of the night breakdowns, you name it, I handled it. Meanwhile, Trevor was in his 4th college in 5 years. First it was a tech school up north, then some liberal arts college 2 states over, then a community college near home, then an online innovation academy that cost a fortune and folded after 9 months. Every time he dropped out, it was somehow reframed as progress. He's figuring things out, Mom would say. He just needs to find his passion. They called it soul searching. I called it wasting money. But I never said that out loud. Not once. Instead, I got the phone calls. They always started the same way. Michael, you know how much we appreciate you. That was the preamble. Then, you've always been the stable one. Your brother looks up to you so much. A pause, a sigh. It's just, he's really trying. He wants to go back and finish his degree. We just need a little help. Books, mostly. Maybe part of the tuition until his loans clear. It was never just books. It was never just tuition. And the loans? I'm still not convinced any ever existed. Mom had this way of making me feel like denying her meant I was punishing Trevor. Like I was the one jeopardizing his progress. She'd say things like, he doesn't have your work ethic. But if he sees you supporting him, maybe it'll motivate him. Or, you know he's sensitive. We just need to keep him going until he finds his footing. Once, after one of those calls, I remember hanging up and just sitting there in my work truck, engine off, drenched in sweat, staring at my steering wheel. I had just pulled a double shift, 14 hours on job sites, climbed through 3 crawl spaces, and had a bruise on my arm from a condenser unit falling sideways. My back ached. My hands were scraped up. And I had just zelled $600 to my mother so Trevor could buy a new laptop after his old one just gave out. They always came to me. Always. You're stable. You're an example. That line became her go-to. It was like a spell. A guilt-laced charm to keep me in line. And I let it work. Every time. Because what was I supposed to say? No. It wasn't just the money. It was how invisible I felt in comparison. Trevor dropped out of school, and everyone rallied around him. I got promoted to lead tech at my company, Crickets. Trevor launched a Kickstarter for an app that didn't exist, and it was like Christmas. He's so entrepreneurial, Dad said at one point. He's got that spark. When I mentioned how much overtime I was pulling to help pay off my student loans early, Mom just said, "That's great, honey. I wish Trevor had your discipline." I think the worst part was how much they believed their own version of things. They genuinely thought they were being fair. Like calling me the strong one was some kind of prize. As if that strength didn't come with weight. As if they weren't loading every burden onto my back because they knew I'd carry it. I started tracking it one year. Just for myself. Every transfer, every temporary loan. Every time I bailed Trevor out of a late rent payment or covered a course he never finished or sent cash for groceries when he claimed his card got declined. In 12 months, I sent a total of $5,428. I never once got a thank you from Trevor. The only acknowledgement I got was from Mom, and even then, it was couched in guilt. "I just don't know what we'd do without you," she said once, after asking for help covering Trevor's moving expenses when he decided he needed to be in a more inspiring environment. I asked her what that meant, and she said, "You know, a place where he can really focus on building his future." He moved into a loft downtown with 2 other guys who were trying to start a podcast. They had a neon sign that said "Create or Die" over the kitchen sink. Trevor was the only one not paying rent. I found that out later, when the landlord accidentally sent the invoice to my email because I had used my card to cover the deposit. Even when I tried to pull back, they didn't let me. One time I told Mom I couldn't help. My water heater had just blown, and I was stretched thin after a slow month. She got quiet. Then she said, "Of course. I understand. I just worry about him, that's all. I don't know if he'd make it without you. But no, you've done enough. You need to focus on yourself." I caved an hour later. Sent the money. Told myself it was the last time. It wasn't. Because when you're the strong one, you get used to being leaned on. And when everyone else gets to be the mess, your stability becomes your trap. And they will always, always expect you to pull. I don't remember the exact moment I started keeping track. Maybe it was after the 4th or 5th emergency that month, or maybe it was when my own credit card got declined buying parts for a job because I had just wired Trevor another rent payment. Either way, I opened a spreadsheet one night and started listing every dollar I'd sent his way. I didn't even think it would amount to much. I figured a few grand, maybe 5 or 6,000 at worst. I was wrong. I stayed up past midnight combing through old bank statements, Venmo history, Zelle transfers, even texts and emails. "Can you float me till the end of the month? Card trouble again. I'll pay you back after my tax return hits." Spoiler, that never happened. 10 years worth of bailing him out. And somehow I had never added it up until that night. By the time I was done, The number staring back at me was $75,438. $75,438. Gone. And that was just what I could confirm. There were plenty of vague withdrawals labeled family help that probably went the same way. It didn't all happen at once, of course. It was slow. Death by 1,000 short-term loans. A few hundred here, 1,000 there. It always sounded manageable in the moment. But when you step back and look at the full picture, it hits different. I looked at that number for a long time. Then I started scrolling through the list. $3,000 to co-sign on his first apartment in Atlanta. He lasted 4 months there before creative differences with his roommate sent him packing. $6,200 to pay off a used BMW 3 Series that he absolutely didn't need, but said inspired confidence during meetings with potential investors. Investors in what? I never really figured out. $1,500 to fix the transmission on that same BMW after he rear-ended a city bus while texting. $2,300 in overdue credit card payments that he said were from equipment purchases for his graphic design freelance work. As far as I know, that equipment included a GoPro, a second-hand drone, and a custom gaming chair. There was a $5,000 chunk that still makes me sick to think about. That was for a so-called startup he was working on with some guy he met in a Reddit thread, something to do with augmented reality and real estate walkthroughs. It fizzled out after 3 months. The domain expired and they never even built a prototype. And then there was the endless parade of little things. Late rent, cell phone bills, car insurance, tickets, groceries when money was tight, gas money, last-minute flights, broken laptops, therapy sessions, classes he never finished, job applications he never submitted. I ran the numbers again just to be sure. I even cross-checked it with my own financial goals. With that money, I could have opened my own HVAC company. I had the experience, the contacts, even a few guys willing to come on board if I ever made the jump. I'd priced it out once. Between the licensing, equipment, van, and first year of marketing, I would have needed about 60 grand to start comfortably. I'd be my own boss right now. Or I could have paid off my mortgage. I still had about 85 grand left on the house. 75,000 would have knocked it down to almost nothing. I could have lived debt-free in 5 years. Instead, I was still waking up at 5:30 every morning, climbing into a 10-year-old work truck with 180,000 miles on it, running calls for someone else's company, and packing my lunch in the same Tupperware I've used since 2013. All while Trevor was living in a downtown loft with exposed brick walls, making TikToks about the struggles of being a creative in a corporate world. Last I checked, he was doing tarot readings on Instagram for Energy Exchange and working on a documentary about mental health in digital spaces. It had been in production for 2 years. No footage yet, just concept development. But what really got me, what sent me over the edge, was a conversation I had with my mom a few months back. She called, same warm tone as always. "Michael, honey, I hope you're doing okay. Listen, Trevor's been feeling really low lately. He's thinking of taking a break from the city. Maybe come stay with you for a while, just to reset." I didn't say anything at first. I was sitting in my truck in the parking lot of a strip mall, sun beating down through the windshield. I looked over at my lunchbox on the passenger seat. Same sandwich I ate every Thursday. Then she said it. The line she always used when I hesitated. "You're strong. You've always been the strong one. And strong always pulls. Strong always pulls." Like it was my job. Like I was built for this. Like the reason Trevor kept falling was because I was meant to catch him. I hung up without answering. That night, I printed the spreadsheet. I taped it to my fridge. I wanted a reminder. Every time I opened the door to grab a beer, I wanted to see exactly what it had cost me to be the strong one. $75,438. It didn't feel like love anymore. It felt like theft. By the time I pulled into the parking lot, my shirt was stuck to my back, my knuckles were filthy, and my boots felt like bricks. I had just finished a 12-hour shift at a warehouse facility that hadn't had a working HVAC system in weeks. The whole place smelled like melting plastic and stale sweat. One of the rooftop units had blown a capacitor and leaked oil everywhere, so I'd spent most of the day crawling around in a metal box under the Georgia sun, trying not to pass out. I didn't even have time to shower. Just wiped off my face with a wet rag, changed into a clean shirt I kept behind the seat, and hoped the deodorant I reapplied would hold. Grace was turning 6. My niece. Trevor's daughter with an ex he barely co-parents with, and whose presence in her life came and went depending on his mental state or latest project. But today, apparently, he was all in. The invitation said it was just a small gathering with close friends and family. That should have been my first clue. When I walked into the event hall, I honestly thought I was in the wrong place. The room was massive, elegant, the kind of venue people rent for weddings. White drapes along the walls. A DJ in a booth. Champagne towers. Actual ice sculptures, 2 swans, if you can believe it, and waiters walking around in black shirts and vests holding trays of crab cakes and shrimp shooters. The tables were covered in silk tablecloths with little LED candles glowing in the centerpieces. Kids in matching outfits were running around with party favors that probably cost more than my monthly gas bill. I stood there at the entrance for a second, dazed, sweaty, holding a wrapped Barbie doll in pink gift paper that I suddenly felt stupid for bringing. I had bought it during my lunch break at Target because I knew Grace loved the beach-themed dolls. Now it looked like I'd shown up to a gala with a gas station balloon. Then I spotted Trevor near the bar, laughing with a group of people. I didn't recognize any of them, but they looked like the usual crew he surrounded himself with. Artsy, polished, sipping champagne like it was a Tuesday afternoon brunch in LA. I started to head his way when he spotted me and waved me over. "Hey, look who finally made it," he said loud enough for the whole group to hear. "Michael the legend." I tried to smile, said hey, handed him the gift. He barely looked at it before tossing it onto a nearby table already stacked with gift bags from places like Pottery Barn Kids and Nordstrom. Then he turned to his friends and said, "This is my big brother Michael. He's a plumber." "Well, not really. He's got a degree, don't you, Mike?" He clapped me on the shoulder and grinned, like he'd just said something clever. I didn't answer. "I'm not a plumber. I'm a certified HVAC technician and hold 3 state licenses. I own tools worth more than his car, but I've learned not to take the bait." Then he added, "Michael pays for everything, as usual. He doesn't have anything to spend on but his family." He laughed, and they laughed with him, like it was some kind of inside joke. One of the women even looked at me and said, "Wow, that's really sweet of you." I just stood there, my jaw clenched. My hands, filthy from the day's work, still felt stained no matter how hard I'd scrubbed them in the truck stop bathroom on the way over. I looked around that room, that absurd, over-the-top circus of a child's birthday party, and realized something that hit me harder than any insult he'd ever thrown. He didn't even know what I'd paid for anymore. The balloons? I paid the invoice. The deposit on the venue? Charged to my card last month when my mom called in a panic because the original place fell through. Grace's school tuition? I'd quietly been covering it since last fall when Trevor needed to focus on a new creative opportunity. My mom told me it was temporary, just a semester. That was 9 months ago. I watched Trevor hand a glass of champagne to a guy who introduced himself as a visual experience consultant and called Grace his whole world. I watched him hold her on his hip for 5 seconds so someone could snap a photo, then hand her off to a sitter before heading back to the DJ booth to help curate the playlist. I realized then that I had paid for this whole damn spectacle. Not just in money, but in time, in labor, in years of bending backward to make up for his failures. And now he was standing there, mocking me in front of strangers, reducing my entire existence to a punchline. I didn't say anything. I didn't make a scene. I just turned around, walked back to my truck, and sat behind the wheel with the engine off. My hands were shaking, not with anger, not even with shame. Just the slow boil of years turning into decades. I sat there long enough for the sweat to dry on my back and my shirt to stiffen. Then I turned the key, backed out, and drove away without saying goodbye. I didn't yell. I didn't make a scene. I didn't throw the champagne glass across the room or call him out in front of all his perfectly curated little entourage. I just turned around and walked out, past the sculpted swans, the $500 balloon arch, and the waiters offering me a mini crab cake I couldn't even stomach. I didn't say goodbye to Grace, though I wish I had. She was the only one in that room who didn't know she was standing in the middle of a lie. By the time I got to my truck, the sun had dipped low enough to turn the windshield into a mirror. I sat there in silence, my hands resting on the steering wheel, watching my own reflection fade as the light shifted. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just opened the banking app on my phone and scrolled to the second credit card listed under my name. It had Trevor's name on it. I had given it to him almost 2 years ago. Back then, it was supposed to be a safety net. Only for emergencies, I'd said. Just until you get back on your feet. He never paid a dime on it, but I kept the balance low, kept checking the statements, kept hoping he wouldn't abuse it. Of course he did. Small charges at first, gas stations, grocery stores. Then came the Uber rides, the concert tickets, the subscription services I'd never heard of. 1 month, he spent $300 on what turned out to be a series of online courses about monetizing your spiritual brand. Another time, I found an $80 charge to a custom candle website. I stared at the screen, thumb hovering over the freeze card button. Then I pressed it. A little animation played, a cartoon padlock clicked shut, and that was it. Quiet, clean, final. I sat back in the seat and let out a long, slow breath. It wasn't much. It wasn't a speech or a confrontation or some grand moment of redemption, but it was something. A crack in the dam. Then I opened my messages and pulled up a thread with my boss, Don. I stared at the blinking cursor for a second, then typed, "Hey, any chance I can pick up that Saturday shift you mentioned? I'm free all day." Sent it without waiting for a response. That was it. 2 small actions. Block a card. Pick up a shift. But in that moment, they felt bigger than anything I'd done in years. Not because they changed the past. Not because they undid the money I'd lost or the years I'd spent cleaning up someone else's mess. Because for once, I wasn't carrying anyone else. Just myself. And for the first time in a long, long while, that felt like enough. When I got home, I didn't turn on the lights. I kicked off my boots by the door, walked straight into the kitchen, and sat down at the table with my laptop. I didn't feel angry anymore. I wasn't boiling or shaking or pacing around like I used to when things with Trevor got under my skin. I felt calm, focused, like I had been preparing for this moment without even realizing it. I opened my banking portal and clicked into the joint account we had set up years ago. It had been my idea, back when I still believed that structure and a little oversight would help him manage money better. I told myself it was temporary, that I'd just help him through one rough patch. I never closed it. I don't even know why. Maybe guilt. Maybe inertia. Either way, I stared at the balance, $62 and some change, and clicked the Close Account button. Done. Next, I found the standing transfer I'd been sending every month. $250 on the first of each month, labeled Grace, Enrichment. That had been set up at Mom's request. She said it was for dance classes, sometimes tutoring. "She's got talent, Michael. Don't let the chaos around her hold her back," she'd said. And so I paid it, even when I couldn't afford it. Even when Trevor was posting selfies from wine bars or co-working spaces that charged admission like nightclubs. I canceled the recurring payment. It felt surgical, quiet, like cutting off a limb that had been infected for too long. Then I opened a spreadsheet I hadn't touched in over a year. Agreements with Trevor. That was the title. A whole folder of PDFs and scans. Things I had typed up myself over the years to try and formalize all the money I'd lent him. We had both signed them. Some on napkins, some with fake witness lines, some half-jokingly notarized by a friend of his who bought a stamp online. They were all garbage. Legal theater. A way for me to pretend that this wasn't just enabling, that there was structure and intent and some kind of eventual fairness. I opened one after another. Promises to repay $1,500 for the BMW repair. A note agreeing to return $3,000 within 6 months from the short film budget that disappeared without a single scene being shot. A printed email chain where he swore he'd return the full tuition amount from his last failed online course if the app he was developing got traction. Every document had the same thing in common. Not a single cent had ever come back. I dragged the entire folder to the trash. I didn't hesitate. Then I walked over to the filing cabinet in the hallway, opened the bottom drawer, and found the manila envelope with hard copies. It had T written in red marker. I pulled them out, one by one, sat back down at the kitchen table, and started feeding them into the shredder. The motor whirred, the pages turned to strips, and I watched them fall into the bin like dry leaves. It didn't feel dramatic. It didn't feel cathartic. It felt necessary. When I finished, I emptied the shredder into a garbage bag, tied it shut, and carried it outside. The night air was cooler than I expected. It smelled faintly of someone grilling down the street. I dropped the bag into the can, closed the lid, and stood there for a moment with my hands resting on the plastic. There was no text to send. No speech to give. No grand declaration. There was only silence. And finally, that silence felt like peace. The first call came at 7:12 the next morning, just as I was stepping out of the shower. I let it ring. Trevor. Then 2 minutes later, Mom. Then Trevor again. Then a number I didn't recognize. The voicemails started piling up one after another. Some frantic, some calm, but loaded with guilt. By the time I finished my coffee, my phone had registered 17 missed calls and nearly 24 unread messages. And it didn't stop. Over the next 24 hours, it turned into a full-on telephone apocalypse. 40 calls, 60 texts, half of them from Trevor, the rest a chaotic mix of family, old acquaintances, even people I hadn't heard from in years. Trevor's ex messaged me. So did one of his podcast co-hosts I met once at a cookout 2 summers ago. The content varied, but the tone was consistent. Outrage, desperation, accusation, begging. Trevor's first message was just, "What the hell are you doing?" Then, "You're really going to screw me like this?" Then, "Call me right now, or this gets ugly." Mom tried the softer approach. "Sweetheart, please talk to me. This is just a misunderstanding. Grace shouldn't suffer because of adult disagreements." Then, "You know Trevor doesn't handle stress well. We're all so worried." Then came Dad. Short and cold, as always. "Grow up. You've made your point. Now fix this before it gets worse." Trevor's friend Tyler, The one who once hit me up for money as a business partner sent a message that said, "You're acting like a child. Trevor's under a lot of pressure. This is how you repay him." My aunt texted, "Your mom's in tears. Are you really cutting off your niece too? Be better." And then the real venom started showing up. "You're abandoning your family. You'll regret this." What about Grace, huh? You just gonna let a 6-year-old suffer? Hope you sleep while knowing your own niece can't go to school next month. One message just read, "You're dead to us." That one was from Trevor. It was a flood, a coordinated campaign of guilt and pressure, like they'd all gotten in a group chat and decided how to break me down piece by piece. Some played nice. Some lashed out. Some tried legal threats, like I hadn't just canceled a few payments that were never part of any formal obligation. One of Trevor's friends actually said, "You can't just abandon a child financially. That's neglect." I laughed when I read that one. Out loud. In my own kitchen, holding my phone, standing in my work clothes before sunrise. I actually laughed. The thing was, they all thought they were saying something new. Something persuasive. Like no one had ever told me to think of Grace before. Like I hadn't already considered every angle, every implication, every consequence. As if this decision hadn't taken a decade to finally make. I didn't respond to a single one. I put my phone on silent and flipped it face down on the table. The vibrations came in waves all day, rattling against the wood like some small, trapped animal. I let it shake. I let it buzz. I didn't touch it. Not once. She finally got me on the phone late in the evening. I had just gotten home from the extra shift I picked up and was halfway through reheating some leftover chili when the screen lit up again with her name. I don't know why I answered. Maybe I just wanted to hear what excuse she'd come up with. Maybe I was tired of the silence being filled with everyone else's noise. The second I picked up, she was already crying. "Michael," she said, her voice breaking. "I just don't understand what you're doing. You're tearing the family apart because of some jokes? Is that really what this is about?" I didn't say anything for a second. I just sat there at the kitchen table, spoon in hand, letting her words hang in the air. When I finally spoke, my voice came out calm. Not cold. Not angry. Just steady. "It's not a joke," I said. "Your son has been mocking my life for the last 15 years. She went quiet, except for the sound of her sniffling. I heard her try to catch her breath, and then, softly, "He didn't mean it. You know how he is. He jokes when he's nervous." I let out a slow breath and leaned back in my chair. "You weren't there, Mom. You didn't see his face when he said it. You didn't hear him laugh when he told a room full of people I pay for everything because I have nothing else to do. Like I'm some sad, pathetic workhorse who doesn't have a life." She started crying again. "He's just under so much pressure. The party was a lot. He was trying to make people laugh. Why are you doing this now of all times?" I looked around the kitchen. The old linoleum floor. The dent in the fridge from where I dropped the toolbox last winter. The stack of envelopes on the counter, most of them bills. I thought about the years I spent bending over backwards for her version of family unity. Always showing up. Always paying up. Always keeping the peace. "I'm doing this now," I said, "because it never would have stopped on its own. And you know it." More silence. Then she said, "So what? You're just going to punish Grace? She's just a little girl." I rubbed my temple. "No. If Grace needs help, go through her mom. Not Trevor. If it's really about Grace, then take him out of the equation." "You're being so harsh," she whispered. "This isn't like you." "No," I said. "It's not like the version of me you're used to. But this is exactly like me. This is the me that's been paying for everyone's messes while working double shifts and skipping vacations and putting my life on hold for people who laugh behind my back. You just never paid attention." She didn't respond. I heard a faint exhale, like she wanted to argue but didn't have the words. The crying had stopped. "Just quiet now. Still. I'm not yelling, Mom. I'm not cutting you off. I'm just not doing this anymore. Not like this." And then, because there was nothing left to say, I told her good night and hung up. I was on a service call-out indicator, replacing a rooftop unit for an office building that had been without proper cooling for over a week. The sun was brutal that day, mid-90s and not a cloud in sight. I was halfway through wiring the new control board when I heard someone yelling my name from the parking lot below. At first, I thought it was a delivery or someone from the office. Then I looked over the edge of the unit and saw Trevor standing next to his car, shouting up at me like a lunatic. His voice echoed across the lot. "You think this is how you treat family, Mike? You think this is fair?" He was pacing in circles, hands flailing, drawing the attention of half the office staff who had come out to see what the commotion was. I climbed down from the ladder as fast as I could without snapping an ankle. By the time I hit the pavement, he was already walking toward the clients. "This man pretends to be some saint, but he's a fraud," he barked, pointing at me like I was on trial. "He's been lying to everyone. My daughter, our parents." He cut off a 6-year-old. "For money. Who does that?" I didn't say a word. I just stood there, covered in sweat and insulation dust, watching my brother unravel in front of a building full of people I needed to keep happy. My client, a middle-aged woman named Carrie who had been nothing but polite and professional all morning, stepped between us and said, "Sir, I'm going to ask you to leave the property or I'll be calling the police." Trevor turned to her like he couldn't believe what he was hearing. "You're defending him? He's not who you think he is." Then he looked at me. "You think you can just erase me? Block me? Shut me out? You think I'm just going to take that?" I didn't flinch. I just pulled out my phone, kept my eyes on him, and quietly told Carrie, "I'm calling this in." She nodded. He drove off before the cops showed up. But the damage was done. My boss called me that night and said, "Whatever this is, handle it. We can't have scenes like that on job sites." I told him I understood. I didn't sleep much that night. The next evening, just past 9, I was sitting in the living room watching an old movie with a beer when the pounding started. Not knocking, pounding. Fists on the front door, heavy and erratic. I looked through the peephole, and there he was again, sweating, wild-eyed, yelling, "Open the damn door, Mike. We're not done. You don't get to do this to me." To Grace. To Mom. I didn't move. Just picked up the phone and called 911. He started kicking the door, hard, over and over again. The wood splintered a little near the lock, and I heard him screaming something about how I owed him, how I couldn't cut him out like trash. Then sirens. Fast. Blue lights cutting through the living room window before he even realized how loud he'd been. They arrested him right there on my front lawn. Disturbing the peace. Threats. Attempted trespassing. He didn't resist, just kept yelling the whole time, even as they cuffed him. "You're ruining everything. You're the one destroying this family." I stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching as they put him in the back of the cruiser. One of the officers asked me if I wanted to press charges. I said yes. It didn't happen overnight. There wasn't some grand windfall or life-changing moment where everything flipped. It was slow, steady, deliberate. But for the first time in a decade, I was finally moving in a direction that was mine. I started with the basics. Sat down one weekend and mapped out everything I would need to open my own HVAC company. Licenses, insurance, tools, a reliable work van, a small office, nothing fancy, just a place to call my own. I pulled up my credit report, calculated what I could afford to invest, and for the first time, none of it had to be adjusted because of someone else's emergency. I didn't have to pause to cover Trevor's rent or redirect funds to Grace's school payments. My paycheck was mine. My savings stayed in my account. And that silence, the absence of late-night calls, guilt-laced texts, or panicked voicemails, was louder than anything. I found a small commercial space on the edge of town, tucked between a print shop and an old auto parts warehouse. It had been vacant for months, but the plumbing was solid and the electrical was clean. The rent was reasonable, and I could picture my company's name on the window before I even signed the lease. I paid the deposit in full without flinching. The paperwork came next. Licensing through the state, contractor's insurance, new business bank account. I spent hours filing forms and double-checking requirements, and I didn't resent a second of it. I was doing it for me. Every cent I spent was a step toward ownership, toward independence. I posted a listing for part-time help and ended up hiring 2 techs I'd worked with before. Good guys, experienced, no drama. One of them told me during the interview, "I've seen how you work, man. You run a tight ship. I'd follow you any day." That meant more than I let on. Within a month, I had a functioning crew, a stock truck, and real jobs on the calendar under my company's name. The first check I deposited as a business owner hit differently. It wasn't just income. It was proof. Proof that I'd finally stopped pouring myself into someone else's future and started investing in my own. I checked my bank account one Friday night after paying my crew and clearing a vendor invoice. The balance was solid. In the black. No flags. No overdraft. No auto deductions I'd forgotten about. Just mine. And my phone. It didn't ring. It was a Thursday afternoon, and I was in the back office finishing up payroll when my phone buzzed with a message from an unfamiliar number. I almost ignored it. Most unknown numbers these days meant spam or some leftover drama from the mess I'd left behind. But something about the name on the text stopped me cold. "Hi, Michael. It's Emily. Can we talk?" I stared at the screen for a long second. Emily. Trevor's wife. Or at least, that's what she still was at the time. We'd never really been close. She was quiet around me, polite but distant, like she didn't know where I fit into Trevor's carefully curated world. We never had a real conversation that went deeper than birthday pleasantries or quick hellos during holidays. But now she was reaching out, and the timing told me it wasn't casual. I called her back. She picked up immediately, and her voice came through shaky, like she'd either been crying or hadn't slept in days. "I'm sorry for reaching out like this," she said. I didn't know who else to talk to. I told her it was okay, and then she said something that caught me completely off guard. I didn't know you paid for everything. She didn't mean it as an accusation. It wasn't bitter. It was quiet, devastated, like the words physically hurt coming out of her mouth. She'd found out everything. Not just the BMW payments or the rent for the loft or the ballet lessons for Grace. All of it. Every hidden transaction. Every lie wrapped in Trevor's easy charm. The tuition Trevor said he was covering through a family inheritance. The down payment on their car that he told her came from a freelance project. The sudden upgrades to their apartment that, in her words, never lined up with what he actually earned. I thought he was getting better, she said. I thought he was growing up. But he wasn't. He was just really good at making excuses and finding people to carry the weight. Her voice cracked on that last part. I didn't know what to say. I wasn't even angry in that moment. Just tired. Like my body recognized the pattern even before my brain did. She told me she'd confronted him a few nights earlier after discovering an old bank statement he hadn't scrubbed clean. She traced it back to one of the transfers I had made nearly a year ago. From there, it all unraveled. She found messages, receipts, notes he had taken about what to say if she asked too many questions. He had an actual document on his laptop called Income Narrative. That's what he named the file. Narrative. I believed in him, she said, almost whispering. I thought we were building something together. I asked her if she and Grace were safe. She said they were. She'd left with her daughter that morning and moved in with her sister 2 counties over. She had already spoken to a lawyer. Divorce papers were being filed. And more than that, she was filing a fraud complaint. He used my name on credit stuff. He forged my signature once. I didn't want to believe it, but I checked. It's there. There was a long silence after that. Neither of us knew how to close the conversation. Before she hung up, she said one more thing. Thank you. Not just for what you did for Grace. For everything. I'm sorry I never saw it before. I told her she didn't owe me an apology. She did it anyway. Then she hung up. 3 months have passed since the arrest. I didn't follow the details closely, but word got around through mutual contacts and the occasional unavoidable update. Trevor pled down, avoided jail, but the damage was done. His credits trashed, his name burned through most circles he used to float in, and Emily followed through on everything she promised. Divorce finalized. Fraud report filed. Full custody of Grace. He's living in some shared dorm-style housing near the edge of town now, working at a call center for minimum wage, hitching rides to get to his shift because the BMW was repossessed and no one will co-sign for another vehicle. He's 31 years old and has nothing to his name but a duffel bag and the stories he tells himself. I see Grace once a month. Emily and I set it up as part of a routine. Nothing legal, nothing messy, just 2 adults doing what's best for a kid. I help with her reading, sometimes pick her up for ice cream and spelling practice. Take her to the science museum when she's bored of school. I buy her things, sure, but not a single dollar of it has anything to do with Trevor. I don't send money into black holes anymore. I don't patch holes in a sinking ship just to keep it from drifting. My parents still call. Not often, but just enough to remind me they haven't changed. My mom leaves voicemails that start off soft and spiral into sobbing about the broken circle and how she never imagined her boys would grow up like this. My dad leaves shorter messages, tired, flat, usually just a quiet sentence or two about how it's time to move on and forgive. I listen to none of them. They all end up in the archive. Not blocked, not deleted. Just set aside. Like everything else that used to be part of a pattern I finally broke. And you know what? I don't feel like a villain. People like to talk about the bottom, that there is a moment when everything falls apart. But for me, it was not a fall. It was a slow, grinding climb. A quiet, constant effort to give up what was no longer mine. I did not destroy my brother's life. I simply removed myself from the equation that made it all work. This is my story. Thank you for reading my story to the end. I don't know what will happen next, but I know one thing. I'm not going back to where I came from. It wasn't an instant. There was no dramatic fall or loud explosion. It was just one day when I decided that I would no longer carry something that did not belong to me. If anyone is standing on the edge right now and doesn't know what to do next, hang in there. Every little step counts. Take care of yourself and have a good day.